Mid-July 1941. We're barely 3 weeks into Operation Barbarossa. The German armed forces, both the Wehrmacht and the SS, are plowing through Soviet territory, leaving a trail of blood in their wake. But behind them and in front of them, the bloodshed is at this point not any less. Where they occupy, parts of the local population join in the orgy of torture and murder. In front of them, the Soviet political and armed forces are doing their best to stack the corpses of unarmed opponents as fast as their enemy. This is War Against Humanity, a sub-series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. In June, we saw how the practices of civilian retribution through fire and murder by the Wehrmacht from Poland in 39 and 40 was brought first to Crete and then began in the overrun Soviet territories. Here, the Germans were welcomed as liberators from Soviet occupation and domination, and together with Lithuanian anti-Semites, the Holocaust began in Kaunas on June 25th. The Soviet politically motivated police accelerated their forced removal and murder of political prisoners as they scrambled to decide the fate of 140,000 prisoners soon to be behind the German front line. And in the 2 weeks that follow, the Soviet killing operations just accelerate. A little more than a week after the war with Germany starts, on July 3rd, the de facto dictator of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, addresses the people of the Federation via radio. His tone is unusually emphatic. Instead of calling the countrymen comrades or citizens, as he always has in the past, he speaks to them as sisters and brothers. It's not a shift that goes unnoticed to the masses of listeners who have gathered in front of radio sets in their local Soviets, factories, and public institutions across the USSR. Many will later profess that this was the moment when Stalin became more than a leader to them and transcended into a father figure. But this call to his sudden brothers and sisters is a call for bloodshed, not only against the German invader, but also against anyone that is unable or unwilling to fight, and of course, sympathizers with the enemy and perceived enemies from within. We must wage a ruthless fight against all disorganizers of the rear, deserters, panic mongers, and rumor mongers. We must exterminate spies, sabotage agents, and enemy parachutists, rendering rapid aid in all this to our extermination battalions. Together with the extermination commands given by German Führer Adolf Hitler to his forces before the invasion, Stalin's call to arms will turn the German-Soviet conflict into a war of savage butchery both on and behind the front lines. For POWs of both sides, it will often mean no quarter, and both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army now engaged in widespread torture and murder of their prisoners. But the first ones to suffer the consequences of Stalin's words already before they are uttered are the political prisoners of the NKVD. From across the occupied and annexed territories, approximately 1 million deemed to be class enemies for a variety of reasons have already been removed to Siberia in 1939 and 1940. As the threat from Germany has become ever more tangible in the last months, the NKVD have now concentrated on the danger they perceive from elements that might side with the Germans in case of an invasion. By June 1941, the prisoners are largely men and women perceived to have national sympathies, the majority in western Ukraine. As the speed of the Wehrmacht overwhelms the Soviet defenders already on June 23rd, the order from the same day to evaluate who shall be shot quickly turns into a race to kill as many of the prisoners as possible. Over the course of the next 8 days, between 1,200 and 5,000 prisoners will be murdered each day by the NKVD across what is in 2020 Western Ukraine. The worst massacres are in the towns. In Lutsk, 2,754 are slaughtered. In Dubno, around 1,500. Borislav, 1,101. Stanislaviv, 2,500. Kharkiv, 800. Dobromil, 2,000. Sambir, 1,200. Drohobych, 1,000. Ternopil, 1,000. And in Lviv, at least 4,000 are murdered. The exact total number is still disputed in 2020. The NKVD records contain 9,817 liquidated prisoners listed by name. But we also know from the NKVD records that many unnamed victims are among the dead. Credible estimates vary between 15 and 40,000. Now, Despite that they are in the middle of a forced retreat, the NKVD operatives take their time to use especially cruel ways of killing their victims by torture and mutilation. One eyewitness will remember. I can well recall searching for the body of a Ukrainian patriot who was a close friend of mine amongst the corpses. The marks of dreadful tortures were clearly visible on most of the bodies. Broken arms and legs, or their eyes had been put out, and in the case of some of the women, their breasts had been cut off. Many of the prisoners had been killed by large nails driven through their nostrils into their brain, others by having their throats cut. In the prison yard, 3 bodies were exhumed of persons who had apparently been buried alive. It is summer, and the temperatures are high. Many of the corpses are just left to lie in the open and begin to swell and rot immediately. Again and again, the eyewitnesses and any German soldiers that enter town after town where the NKVD has left their macabre work behind will remember how the air was thick with the stench of death. What does that do to the human mind? How do you react? The answer is, at least for some, rage. Rage that a few of the survivors, their friends and relatives, will now turn on their neighbors. The victims of the NKVD are of varying national and ethnic background, but although the NKVD themselves estimate that over half are Poles, more recent analysis shows that about 70% are Ukrainians, either by nationality or by language ethnicity. The rest are Polish, Lithuanian, Romanian, and Belarusians. Among all of them are as many as 20% that are Jewish, and yet it is the Jews that will now partly suffer the consequences. Now, despite that Jews have been just as much the victims of the Soviet repressions, oppression, and ethnic cleansing as anyone else, many in the rest of the population live with the misconception that the Jews are partly or wholly responsible for the Soviet occupation. This is reinforced by confirmation bias, like that there are Bolsheviks with Jewish names and background, that some Jewish refugees fleeing the German persecution in Poland arrive with sympathy for the Soviets. But in reality, the vast majority of Jews have nothing more to do with Bolshevism than anyone else, and it is simply deep-rooted anti-Semitic traditions that leave a portion of the population with the delusion that the Jews are at fault. These myths are also at the heart of the Nazi mythology. And with their orders to exterminate Judeo-Bolshevism, both the Wehrmacht and the SS are now marching into Soviet territory. As the German Army Group North advances through Lithuania towards Russia, many Jewish Lithuanians now find themselves in dire straits. All over the front line, but especially in the path of Army Group North, Jews now fall victim to spontaneous acts of plunder and murder. These activities are noted in the logbooks with disturbing euphemism, like when the 407th Infantry Regiment of the 121st Infantry Division encounters some hidden Jews in a Lithuanian village. The platoon leader simply notes that they were taken care of. But it is when they reach Kaunas on the 25th that things get even worse. On June 24th, the German High Command, Oberkommando des Heeres, the OKH, had issued orders that the army shall stand back and allow for Lithuanian cleansing actions to take place. Roughly a quarter of Kaunas' 200,000 inhabitants are Jewish. On June 25th, gangs start rounding up Jews in the city. The next day, the killing starts. By now, the SS Einsatzgruppe A, under control of Polizeigeneral Walter Stahlecker, have made contact with the groups and turned spontaneous lynching into calculated and structured mass murder. Forts on the outskirts of the city become dedicated execution sites. The third day of the Kaunas pogroms is an especially gruesome event when a Lithuanian unidentified man forces 50 men to line up in front of the Lietukis garage. He proceeds to force them to step forward, one by one, after which he clubs them to death with a steel pipe. All the while, a crowd of men, women, and children cheer him on as the square literally flows with blood. After he's done, he jumps on top of the bodies and plays the Lithuanian anthem on his accordion. Exact numbers of the death toll of the Kaunas pogrom are still missing, but they range between 600 and 4,000. And across the territories now occupied by Germans, similar scenes play out again and again. In Latvia's capital, Riga, Einsatzgruppe A initiates a pogrom on the 4th of July, again with aid from the local population. All synagogues in the city are burned down and roughly 400 Jews are murdered. Between June 29 and July 6th in the Moldavian city of Iași, roughly a quarter of the 50,000 Jewish inhabitants are killed by Romanian soldiers and policemen after Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu makes clear he wants to rid the city of its Jewish population. Thousands more are loaded onto trains to be deported to Calarici, but the 3-day journey without sanitation, food, and water kills the vast majority of them. In Bielce and Jedinace, Romanians kill another 1,000 Jewish citizens. Although these events might seem like spontaneous acts of mob rage, they are part of the greater plan for the invasion by Germany and its allies. In Kaunas, Polizeigeneral Stahlecker of Einsatzgruppe A notes, these self-cleansing operations went smoothly because the army authorities, who had been informed beforehand, showed understanding for this procedure. Romanian General Vasiliu has ordered his officers to cleanse the land of Jews, and so on. But it's also important to understand that despite Hitler's orders from May and early June to exterminate the Nazi idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, it is not yet formulated into a clear doctrine of genocide. The events of these 2 weeks in June-July 1941 are yet another progression in the steady march towards an industrial system of mass murder. But the murder's intent now accelerates as more and more forces gather around that idea. For instance, on June 30th, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists pronounced independence in yet another vain action inspired by the fantasy that Germans have come as liberators. And in that same vein, they also declared that the Jews are the enemy and they must be destroyed. The Nazi war of extermination has become a bullhorn, gathering the hateful, blowing foul air into a vacuum of humanity, calling even to those that have not so long ago themselves faced the wrong end of the Nazi gun barrels. Anti-Semitic traditions and delusions of Jewish Bolshevism also ignite the flames of murderous emotions in eastern Galicia and eastern Poland. Here, Poles and Ukrainians alike take part in the killing. In Netsvitska and surrounding villages, Jews are forced out of their houses to be thrown overboard from a ferry on the river Dniester. In Solochiv, from the 2nd to the 4th of July, 3,000 people are killed by locals cooperating with members of Einsatzgruppe C. In Ternopil, Borislav, and other towns, hundreds more are killed. In eastern Poland, in Gradziewo, Wisna, Gonjuns, Stuczyn, Kolno, Wązuch, Stawicki, Rajgrod, Radziwów, hundreds of Jews are killed in the last week of June and first weeks of July. On July 10th, 400 Jewish inhabitants of the Polish village of Yad Vashem are killed by their neighbors. 300 of them are locked up in a barn which is set on fire. How much the German forces who are present are involved and who directs the pogrom is still unclear. Regardless, Polish locals are, at the least, active participants to the mass murders. In Lviv, on June 30th, Jews are rounded up by their neighbors and scapegoated for Soviet occupation and the NKVD massacre. To begin, they are forced to clean the toilets of other civilians, print and distribute German anti-Semitic propaganda, and gather the rotting corpses from the battlegrounds and the NKVD massacre sites. The following day, large groups of Jews are forced to clean the streets with their hands as their non-Jewish neighbors watch. And now, the violence escalates. Women are singled out to be publicly harassed, robbed, and abused. Many are forced to undress before the crowds and often raped. Some of them are then forced to run the gauntlet, where they have to run past rows of tormentors swinging clubs and throwing rocks, often until they die. In an orgy of murder, Jews are now shot, kicked, clubbed, and stoned to death. Some kill themselves when they cannot face the harassment of torture any longer. When this wave of violence is over on July 3rd, 4,000 Jews in Lviv are dead. This is already hell on earth, and it's hard to imagine that it can get any worse. But it can, and it will. The Eastern Front is an inferno that has only barely begun to burn. It is a fire stoked from two sides by ideological fanaticism and delusional ideas. It is guided by a complete disregard for human life, even the lives of the own soldiers as they are sent into the fray against impossible odds, commanded to carry out acts of cruelty that defy the imagination of any decent human being. And now we're seeing that you don't even need a command to set off the slaughter. A gradual descent into hell that started many years ago in Germany and Russia has now accelerated into an avalanche of bloodlust that is only picking up speed and more speed. This is the beginning of Armageddon. I can only hope that looking at these horrors helps us to avoid repeating the errors of our forefathers. To do that, we need to understand as best we can things as they were, while avoiding the ideological blindness that plagued this conflict. Here at Time Ghost, we do our best to document history simply as it was, free of ideological presumptions and without an agenda to promote simple solutions. Become a part of this effort by joining the Time Ghost Army on patreon.com or timeghost.tv. Never forget.